Bienvenue à la faculté de droit de l'Université McGill. Je suis Robert Leckie, le doyen de cette faculté. McGill Law, inspiring legal leadership for global challenges. Fièrement enraciné à Montréal, nous rayonnons dans le monde. Le Centre pour les droits de la personne et le pluralisme juridique a soutenu un niveau d'activité impressionnant durant les étapes précédentes de la pandémie, en organisant de nombreux événements de façon virtuelle. L'année passée, lorsque les activités reprenaient sur le campus, le Centre était en chef de file, notamment organisant la superbe conférence Michel Douglas en mars dernier. Je salue l'initiative et la créativité de toute l'équipe affiliée au Centre. Vous avez joué un rôle capital dans la conservation de la vie intellectuelle de la communauté de la faculté de droit durant une période éprouvante, et je vous en remercie du fond du cœur. Il n'en demeure pas moins que pour de nombreuses personnes dans la salle, il se peut qu'il s'agisse d'un premier retour à la faculté de droit et au Centre depuis un bon moment, et c'est donc un moment à célébrer. Merci aux co-directeurs du Centre, le professeur Nandini Ramanujam et Frédéric Mégret. Merci aussi à la coordinatrice administrative Sharon Webb. Je souligne par ailleurs l'appui financier qui rend possible la conférence ce soir, soit le René Cassin Lectureship Fund et le Manuel Schachter Fund. As many of you are aware, we're gathered on the traditional territory of the Nagorno-Karabakh people, and this island has historically been a meeting place for other indigenous nations, including the Algonquin people. I add that our benefactor, James McGill, had at least 5 enslaved individuals in his household. Jack, Sarah, and Marie-Louise were black. Marie Potamian was indigenous, as was a boy whose name we don't know. And there's ongoing research about the university's connections to colonialism and slavery. It's especially appropriate to mention these historical and ongoing connections on the eve of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, and perhaps you'll purchase an orange t-shirt before you leave the atrium. The Faculty of Law is slowly and humbly taking steps to increase the place of Indigenous legal traditions in our teaching and research. For example, the obligatory course in Indigenous legal traditions, set in the first semester of our double degree program, is now in its 3rd iteration, with in-person visits by elders and other members of Indigenous communities much more possible than they were during the Zoom moment. And this past summer, the Faculty of Law ran a pilot project of an Anishinaabe field course led by our colleague, Professor Aaron Mills, in partnership with the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba. So we will continue these and other efforts. And in a moment, I'm going to turn the podium over to the Honourable Joseph Nuss. But before I do so, I just want to salute Emeritus Professor Erwin Kotler. We're delighted to have you back in the faculty. Joseph Nuss is Senior Counsel at Woods LLP, a member of our fabled BCL class of 1958. He's a former Justice of the Quebec Court of Appeal, a King's Counsel, I suppose I say now, King's Counsel, a Fellow of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, and a member of the Order of Canada. And he will introduce this year's René Cassin lecture. I'm so pleased you're here with us this evening and turn things over to you.
Thank you, Dean Leckie. Monsieur le doyen Leckie, Monsieur le professeur Heller, Mesdames, Messieurs, la conférence René Cassin sur les droits de la personne a été inaugurée en mars 1988. Elle avait été établie par les amis canadiens de l'Alliance israélite universelle, dont j'avais l'honneur d'être le président à cette époque. C'est ainsi que nous voulions marquer le centenaire de la naissance du célèbre défenseur des droits de la personne, René Cassin, qui fut le président de l'Alliance israélite universelle pour 3 décennies à partir de 1943. What better way to honor René Cassin and mark the 100th anniversary of his birth than the establishment of a lectureship in his name at the McGill Faculty of Law, which has such an illustrious reputation in the field of human rights. This is the 16th lecture. The previous lectures were organized by the Law Faculty and Inter Amicus, a McGill-based human rights organization whose name is now the highly reputed Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. The previous lectures were delivered by such distinguished jurists as the Chief Justice of Canada, Beverly McLaughlin, in 2002, Justice Claire Leredubé of the Supreme Court of Canada. It was she who delivered the inaugural lecture in March 1988. Ambassador Yves Fortier, who at the time in 1990 was Canada's representative at the United Nations, and more recently, in 2003, by Professor Irwin Cutler, former Attorney General and Minister of Justice of Canada, and in 2018, the eminent and renowned jurist and author Philippe Sands. Le professeur Kevin John Heller, notre conférencier aujourd'hui, est un juriste réputé dont la carrière remarquable fait honneur aux principes qui inspiraient les activités et les œuvres de René Cassin. René Cassin était un soldat français blessé durant la Première Guerre mondiale. Dès son congé de l'hôpital, il a milité en faveur des anciens combattants, les blessés ainsi que les veuves et orphelins. En 1922, il est nommé président de l'Union fédérale des combattants mutilés et veuves de guerre. Il est tout à fait approprié que le thème de la conférence aujourd'hui s'inscrit dans un aspect important de la carrière de René Cassin. This year marks the 74th anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations. The work on the Declaration commenced at the United Nations Commission of Human Rights in 1947. Eleanor Roosevelt was the chair, and René Cassin was one of the Commission members. Cassin was the one who insisted on substituting the word universal for the word international in the draft declaration. The change emphasizes that the declaration applies to all human beings, wherever they may be, regardless of nationality. Cassin stated at the time, "Notre déclaration est une véritable charte de l'humanité." In 1968, Cassin received the Nobel Peace Prize for his endeavors in the promotion of human rights. In 1987, on the occasion of the 100th birthday, his 100th birthday, France paid Cassin the extraordinary honor of having his remains transferred to the Panthéon in Paris. By these lectures, which bear his name, we pay tribute to the admirable achievements of the outstanding humanist René Cassin. It is with great pleasure that we look forward to the lecture of Professor Heller.
Merci beaucoup et merci à vous tous d'être ici au nom de ma co-directrice Nandini Ramanujam. Nous sommes ravis de vous voir à nouveau en personne et de pouvoir recommencer ce cycle des lectures René Cassin qui a laissé une marque importante dans la faculté au fil des années. Je vais avoir le plaisir de présenter mon collègue Kevin John Heller aujourd'hui. Je pense que je vais le faire principalement dans la langue de Shakespeare parce que le français de Kevin est un peu rouillé. So I've known Kevin for a while and we're really delighted to have him today. Kevin is a bit, so I promised to Kevin I wouldn't take more than 10 minutes, so don't worry. Kevin is a bit hard to follow. He's quite ubiquitous. One day he's at the Australian National University in Canberra and Amsterdam at more or less the same time, even as he's using his SOAS email from London, and you kind of remember him being a prof in Melbourne, and he's now moved on to Copenhagen to the Centre of Ministry Studies, where he'll be a professor of international law going forward in the Department of Political Science. That's an exciting new posting for you, Kevin, and a place where I think you can, we look forward to seeing your scholarship continue and develop. So there's an old sense that I think international law has been a nomadic discipline with a long history of influential émigrés from, Gentili and Grotius to Kelsen or Lauterpacht. And I think, Kevin, originally from the US, is a stellar example of a new generation of émigré international lawyers. Cassin was also, of course, briefly an émigré in London for the duration of the war, one of the first to answer de Gaulle's call to rally the resistance. I knew Kevin virtually before I knew him in person, and he was sort of hard to miss as an early blogger, long before anyone thought it was fashionable to blog. And I thought that the only natural channel for academics was articles that were published 2 or 3 years after the events. And a lot of us were intrigued when Kevin started blogging early on, but he set the tone, particularly with his long-time association with Opinio Juris. And was, I think, really a fascinating example of how social networks and blogs have reshaped academia over the last years. He's also someone who, when he's not on Twitter or blogging, is deeply invested in the theory and practice of international criminal law, at a time, of course, when international criminal law has been in a lot of people's minds. And I know, Kevin, you've been very invested in current debates on what the best format would be to make Russian leaders in particular accountable for aggression and war crimes and other offenses. One of his most famous book is what I consider to be the sort of definitive treatment of the Nuremberg, sort of post-Nuremberg, not the big Nuremberg trial, but the Allied Council trials, particularly the American ones, after the Second World War. And it's just such a helpful book, I think, for a generation of international criminal lawyers who needed to be briefed on these early developments that have continued to be influential as we go forward with the international criminal tribunals. I think, Kevin, you're also very well known for your interest in matters of war, both the laws of war, the jus in bello dimension, but also the jus ad bellum aspects. And I'm reminded that not so long ago we co-authored an op-ed for Al Jazeera a few months ago before the invasion of Ukraine, in which we cautioned that an invasion would be a crime under international law. I think we had no illusions that the knowledge of this illegality would have any significant impact, but I think you saw this coming, and we were extremely worried at the time that this would be a direct violation of one of the most central taboos in the international community. You're currently also, among many other projects, working on a book with Sam Moyne on the Vietnam War and international law, and I think the Vietnam War is really ripe for a reappraisal by international lawyers. I won't list all your many accomplishments. I will note that for me, one thing that really stands out is that in addition to your digital activity and your scholarship, you're also someone who has remained immersed in practice and advising and consulting. You were instrumental in the negotiations over the crime of aggression for the International Criminal Court. You worked as Human Rights Watch's external legal advisor on the trial of Saddam Hussein. You served as one of Radovan Karadzic, formerly appointed legal associates at the ICTY, and have intervened in a number of trials, most notably as the plaintiff's expert witness concerning medical experimentation in a leading Alien Tort Statute case against the psychologist who designed and administered the CIA's torture program. So I think I'll leave it there, Kevin, except maybe to say that I think the relevance of today's talk to human rights will be obvious, that war and weapons continue to have a considerable impact on the enjoyment of rights in various places, Ukraine obviously not being the only one. And Kevin, we're delighted to have you, and I very much look forward to hearing your talk. There will be a question period once Kevin is done, and obviously, selon la tradition, bien sûr, les questions peuvent être posées en français. Je me ferai un plaisir de traduire si jamais c'est nécessaire. Kevin, the floor is yours.
I'm very glad this is being recorded because I will never again be mentioned in the same sentence with Grotius and Gentili. So thank you for that. Bonsoir, Madame et Monsieur. It is really quite an honor for me to be here tonight, and my thanks to Fred and to the Dean and to the Justice and to Mr. Cutler for having me. My first academic job interview was at McGill about 16 years ago. You probably know that I was not listed as a McGill faculty member by Fred, so I will let you infer what you will about how that went. But this law school has always held a particularly dear place in my heart, particularly because of my good friend being here. And it's really nice to be able to give this lecture. I do feel a little bit like an imposter. I don't think I will ever be mistaken for a human rights lawyer. I'm going to spend about 35, 40 minutes trying to convince you that insofar as we care about humanity and war, we should probably take the humans out of them. But I do think the connection will be evident, and I hope that you will have strong comments, criticisms, and questions afterward, because we should have plenty of time for that. So, without further ado, autonomous weapons, the typical definition: robotic weapon systems that once activated can select and engage targets without further intervention by a human operator. AWS, as I will sometimes refer to them tonight, are no longer science fiction. In the last 3 years alone, weapons with a fully autonomous mode have been used for offensive purposes in Libya, in Syria, in Nagorno-Karabakh, and by both sides in Ukraine. And there's a Russian one for you. And it's only a matter of time before autonomous weapons become ubiquitous on the battlefield. The military advantages that they potentially provide, particularly superior targeting precision, speed, force protection, have led to an increasingly frantic and increasingly expensive arms race by the great powers, particularly the US, China, and Russia, to develop them, manufacture them, and in many cases, even export them. So the urgency with which powerful states are developing autonomous weapons has been met by an equally urgent campaign to ban them. The campaign to stop killer robots was founded in 2013 and is currently supported by more than 180 human rights organizations worldwide, including some of the most popular, the most famous ones, like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. So I want to begin the lecture with a quote from the campaign to stop killer robots. This quote, I think, captures the essence of most people's opposition to autonomous weapons. Notice how often the campaign invokes the concept of humanity. That's not idiosyncratic. On the contrary, the idea that, quote, killer robots are problematic precisely because they are not, in fact, human, is at the heart of essentially every critique of autonomous weapons. So in the time that I have today, I want to challenge the human-centered critique of autonomous weapons. And I'm going to make three, hopefully, interrelated arguments. First, I will argue that the critique assumes a very specific concept of the human, namely the Enlightenment subject who perceives the world accurately, exercises rational judgment, and is unsullied by negative emotion. Second, I'll argue that the power of the human-centered critique of autonomous weapons dissipates once we acknowledge the situatedness and the failings of ordinary humans, particularly humans exposed to the danger, stress, and uncertainty of combat. Given the cognitive limits of human soldiers, there seems to be little question that autonomous weapons will eventually be able to outperform them in terms of compliance with international humanitarian law. And then third, and finally, I will argue that acknowledging the coming practical superiority of autonomous weapons over human soldiers leaves us with essentially two choices, neither of which, I think, supports banning them. If our goal is to humanize war, we should actively encourage states to develop autonomous weapons. And if our goal is to end war itself, then autonomous weapons are the very least of our concerns. Let me begin by discussing deontological objections to the use of autonomous weapons. Arguments that autonomous weapons are, quote, mala in se, evil in themselves, regardless of the consequences of using them. There are three deontological arguments that I think worth dwelling for a moment on. The first is that it is simply unethical to allow autonomous weapons to decide to use lethal force, because the decision to kill requires the kind of moral judgment that only humans possess. This is the late special rapporteur for extrajudicial executions. The problem with this argument, as I see it, is that it is a misuse of language to say that an autonomous weapon, quote, decides to kill. An AWS selects targets based solely on the parameters that have been programmed into it by humans. If its programming does not specify a particular kind of object or person as targetable, it cannot and will not target that kind of person or object. The decision to kill is thus made by the humans who program the autonomous weapon and who send it into combat, not by the autonomous weapon itself. If I can separate my pages. Those humans, are the ones who bear moral responsibility for any deaths the AWS causes. Now, to be sure, the humans who program an autonomous weapon do not know in advance each and every target that an autonomous weapon might select. But the same is true of many weapons that have long been considered legal. For example, not only does a bombardier not know what precisely his bombs are going to actually strike, in fact, since the 1930s and the creation of the Norden bomb sight, computers and not humans have been making the decision to actually open the bombardier doors and release the bomber's payload. The only material difference between an autonomous weapon and that kind of weapon that has long been considered legal is that the autonomous weapons are far more precise with their targeting. The second deontological argument, it also focuses on the individual who kills. This argument insists that the decision to kill must always be a difficult one. The killer must be fully aware of the gravity of his actions. Autonomous weapons obviously do not and cannot have such awareness, so they cannot ethically kill, so the argument goes. The problem with this argument is that it is significantly, and in my view fatally, under-inclusive, because very few killings committed by human soldiers would satisfy this suffering requirement. In close-up combat, where soldiers are literally face-to-face, killing is a nearly automatic process motivated by the desire for self-preservation. Soldiers who kill in order to live can hardly be said to possess, quote, psyches burdened by the accompanying responsibilities. Now, to be sure, soldiers who kill might indeed have burdened psyches after the firefight is over, and that is a relevant difference between human soldiers and autonomous weapons. But not all soldiers feel the emotional burden of killing, particularly those who kill remotely, and they are an ever greater percentage of the individuals who kill in combat. Numerous empirical studies of drone pilots, for example, have found that very few of these, quote, cubicle warriors, as they have been called, are morally burdened by their actions. On the contrary, many exhibit a, quote, PlayStation mentality in which they either don't think about the consequences of their actions or, in fact, actually enjoy the killing. The quote on the slide from a young drone pilot is, unfortunately, anything but idiosyncratic. The third and final deontological argument focuses not on the individual who kills, but on the individual who is killed. Here the claim is that machine killing is inherently unethical because being killed by a machine is simply dehumanizing. Now, I think this argument is based on an unacceptable romanticization of warfare. Most modern warfare is at a distance, the remote-controlled drone, the high-altitude bomber. It's difficult to understand, at least to me, you can let me know if you disagree when we have questions. It is difficult to understand why being killed by a missile fired by an autonomous weapon hovering over a battlefield is more dehumanizing than being killed by a missile fired from a drone hovering over the same battlefield, or by a bomb dropped from 35,000 feet. For the drone pilot or bombardier, the nameless, faceless individuals who are killed are no less data points than the individuals who are killed by a machine. Close-up combat. Close-up combat is scarcely different. To be sure, the victim's subjective perception of death might be different, depending on whether it will be delivered by a machine or by a human. But that presumes a quick, clean death at the hand of either, when in fact, in reality, the victim is likely to be killed by a grenade or a flamethrower or even a fatal yet poorly aimed bullet. I simply fail to see how the killings respect the humanity of the victim more than the instant death delivered by a killer robot. Again, you can let me know if you disagree. So in short, none of the deontological arguments against autonomous weapons, I think, really withstand scrutiny. There are simply no morally relevant differences between machine killing and human killing. Dead is dead, as they say. But there is, I think, an even more fundamental problem with deontological arguments, and that is precisely their deontology. As I noted earlier, deontological arguments are strictly non-consequentialist. They would prohibit states from using autonomous weapons, even if replacing human soldiers with autonomous weapons would in fact lead to fewer civilian casualties in war. Put more starkly, deontologists would prefer a conflict with 2,000 civilian deaths caused by human soldiers over a conflict with 1,000 civilian deaths caused by machines. Now, you might not believe me, so consider the quotes on the slide. Deontologists are quite open about their preferences for more human deaths than fewer machine deaths. I think it beggars belief that philosophers who passionately invoke concepts like human dignity, when they're criticizing autonomous weapons, accept unnecessary death on the battlefield as long as humans are causing it. And I find it utterly bizarre to argue, as Robin Geist does, that, in fact, irrational human killings in combat are somehow more moral than rational machine ones. Now, to be fair, most critics of autonomous weapons are not deontologists. Instead, the most common argument against them is explicitly consequentialist, namely, that their use will increase civilian casualties because complying with the rules of international humanitarian law require the kind of rational judgment and emotional awareness that only humans possess. Now, I disagree with this argument, and I do so for two reasons. The first is that the argument underestimates the potential of autonomous weapons. Although there are notable dissenters, like the roboticist Noel Sharkey, many, if not most roboticists and AI experts believe that it's really only a matter of time before autonomous weapons are able to comply with international humanitarian law in most situations. But I don't want to dwell on the technology in this lecture. Instead, I want to focus on the second reason why I reject the consequentialist argument against autonomous weapons, namely that it fundamentally overestimates the ability of human soldiers to comply with IHL. Simply put, the consequentialist argument valorizes a particular conception of the human that is belied by literally decades of research in cognitive psychology. It is humans precisely as they are, not as critics of autonomous weapons would like them to be, that explains why combat using machines is likely at some point to be far more humane than combat with human soldiers. So let's talk about this. At the outset, we need to be clear about what kind of cognition is necessary to comply with IHL, with international humanitarian law. Consider the principle of distinction, which categorically prohibits intentionally attacking civilians or civilian objects. Scholars often claim, and here's Mr. Sharkey, that autonomous weapons will never be able to comply with this principle because determining whether an individual is targetable requires the ability to assess her subjective mental state, something that humans can do but autonomous weapons cannot. Now, I agree with the technical pessimism, but the claim that the principle of distinction requires an attacker to determine the target's mental state is dramatically overstated. In fact, targetability is almost always determined on the basis of objective, externally manifested signs and behavior, rendering what is actually going on in the target's mind completely irrelevant. That's a critical point because there is no reason to believe that human soldiers will always be better at recognizing those signs and behaviors than autonomous weapons. And if autonomous weapons ever do become better at object recognition than humans, the distinction objection will fundamentally collapse. Now, the relevance of subjective mental states to the principle of distinction is most obvious in the context of recognizing combatants, whether members of a state's armed forces or members of an organized armed group. On the bottom right is the Kosovar Liberation Army, the KLA. Determining whether an individual is a combatant requires nothing more than the ability to recognize that she is wearing a uniform or exhibiting a fixed and distinctive sign. If she is, her mental state is irrelevant. International humanitarian law permits her to be attacked anytime, anywhere, with any amount of force. Quite straightforward. Now, to be sure, there are situations in which the principle of distinction is more difficult to apply. One situation, commonly mentioned by critics of autonomous weapons, is where a combatant is surrendering. In their view, as illustrated by this quote, identifying surrender requires the ability to determine whether a combatant intends to surrender, something autonomous weapons with their inability to determine mental states obviously cannot do. But once again, critics like Sparrow confuse the subjective and the objective. It is true that a combatant must intend to surrender to qualify as hors de combat. Under international humanitarian law, however, that intent must be externally manifested through specific types of action. Note the wording of Article 41 of the first additional protocol. It does not protect a combatant who intends to surrender. It protects a combatant who has, quote, clearly expressed an intention to surrender. That's not a semantic difference, it's a fundamental one. If a combatant does not externally manifest his intention to surrender in one of the ways mentioned in the ICRC's commentary, he remains a lawful target, even if, in his heart of hearts, he genuinely wants to stop fighting. Similarly, if the combatant does manifest a clear intention to surrender, he cannot be targeted even if he actually intends to start shooting at the enemy the minute that his enemy comes over to him. In other words, an act of perfidy. It is only when he externally manifests his perfidiousness that it would be lawful to start shooting at him again. So surrender doesn't indicate that subjective mental states are necessary for compliance with the principle of distinction. Now, there is an even more difficult situation with the principle of distinction worth considering, and that's direct participation in hostilities. When a civilian DPHs, or directly participates in hostilities, he loses his protection against attack for the duration of his direct participation. Now, critics often claim that autonomous weapons will simply never be able to distinguish between civilians and civilians who directly participate in hostilities. Why? Because that distinction requires assessing the civilian's intent. So Human Rights Watch focuses on a hypothetical scenario in which a frightened mother runs after her 2 children to stop them from playing with toy guns near a soldier. In its view, an autonomous weapon would be far more likely than a human soldier to misunderstand the situation and unlawfully attack the children. Now, this is a very challenging scenario. I openly acknowledge how challenging it is. So let's examine it. Children, like it or not, and I think we probably all don't like it, children become lawful targets if they directly participate in hostilities. The key issue in this scenario, therefore, is whether the soldier recognizes that they are holding toy guns and not real ones. If he recognizes that they are holding toy guns, the children are civilians and they're absolutely protected against attack. It doesn't matter whether they hate the soldier. It doesn't matter whether the children are pointing the toy guns at the soldier instead of pointing it at each other while playing. They cannot be lawfully attacked because they're not carrying a real weapon and they're not directly participating in hostilities. So in this scenario then, would an autonomous weapon be more likely than a human to mistakenly conclude that the guns are real? In terms of object recognition, there's no reason to believe that this would be the case. An advanced autonomous weapon system could be programmed to distinguish between a toy gun and a real gun and, say, something like a stick. But what if the toy guns look like real guns? This is a real photo from Iraq during Eid, kids playing with extremely realistic-looking guns. Would a human be more likely to correctly infer from the mother's fear and the children's actions that the guns were nevertheless actually toys? Here, I think that is probably the case. Now, there's no reason to believe that an autonomous weapon couldn't recognize a look of fear as well as a human could, but a human may well be better able to understand the meaning of the mother's fear, that it's more likely motivated by the possibility of a terrible misunderstanding than by not wanting harm to come to 2 young insurgents. And there's no question that a human would be more likely to recognize the children's actions, despite their seemingly real guns, as play instead of as an actual attack. So I'm not claiming that human judgment is irrelevant on the battlefield. In principle, there will indeed be situations, particularly like the children playing, that raise the issue of direct participation, where a human's understanding of the nuances of human emotion and the nuances of human behavior might in fact make him less likely than a machine to violate the principle of distinction. The key to this qualifier, however, is the expression "in principle." The analysis so far assumes that despite initially believing that the toy guns are real, the human soldier is nevertheless able to reach the correct interpretation of the situation, accurately perceiving the mother to be frightened, accurately understanding that the children are playing, correctly inferring from those two circumstantial facts that the guns are actually toys, and lowering his own weapon before opening fire. In perfect circumstances, a human soldier might be able to do all of those things. But there are no perfect situations, are no perfect circumstances in combat. Let's make the scenario more realistic. Assume that the soldier is relatively green, hasn't slept for 36 hours, is terrified of being killed, and recently lost a close friend at the hands of the enemy. Assume that he comes across the children while fighting is still raging all around him, and assume that the children are 15. Still children, but more than old enough to kill. This is a very different situation, to put it mildly. Indeed, cognitive psychology tells us that the human soldier is now very likely to make a serious mistake concerning perception, or judgment, or action, or in fact all three. Perhaps the human soldier now misperceives the mother's emotion as anger instead of fear. Perhaps now he mistakes pointing the toy guns at him as a hostile act instead of as happy play. Or perhaps now he pulls the trigger reflexively instead of deliberately releasing it. If the human soldier makes any of those mistakes, much less all of them, the children are dead and he has violated the principle of distinction. So my point is this. When critics argue that autonomous weapons will never be able to comply with IHL as well as human soldiers because they lack human judgment, the critics are assuming a very specific conception of the human, namely the Enlightenment subject. The subject who perceives the world accurately, exercises rational judgment, is impervious to negative emotions, and reliably translates thought into action. If that human existed, there is no question human soldiers would usually, if not always, be preferable to autonomous weapons. But that human doesn't exist. On the contrary, if we have learned anything from cognitive psychology over the past few decades, it is to be profoundly skeptical of the Enlightenment subject. Humans do not make decisions rationally, dispassionately, and objectively. Instead, their decision-making is profoundly distorted by cognitive biases and by negative emotions. And that is particularly true in combat, where life and death decisions have to be made extremely quickly in situations marked by danger and uncertainty. Now, I could pause here and mention some of the many notorious massacres carried out purely by human soldiers: Cassin, My Lai, Halabja, Sinjar, Bucha. But instead, let me give you some statistics about fratricide, friendly fire killings. During Operation Desert Storm in Iraq in 1990 and 1991, friendly fire accounted for 24% of all American battlefield casualties and 77% of all destroyed American armored vehicles. Scholars who have studied this have attributed 80 to 85% of those friendly fire incidents to errors of human cognition. That's a staggering percentage, and one that I think should give us pause when we reflexively insist that human soldiers are, merely by virtue of their humanity, inherently superior to robotic ones. Now, I don't have time, and you probably don't have the interest, for me to give you an in-depth look at how cognitive biases and negative emotions distort the decision-making of human soldiers. So let me simply mention 3 of the former and 2 of the latter. The first bias is cognitive overload. Studies have found that soldiers must focus almost all of their attention on an unknown individual to determine whether they are a soldier or a civilian. In combat, however, soldiers are almost always required to multitask. Infantry, for example, have to simultaneously move, identify targets, operate their weapons, listen to their commander over the radio, and so on. Such multitasking significantly reduces the accuracy of target identification because it overloads soldiers' attentional capacity. And that cognitive overload becomes even worse in normal combat situations, such as the ones I added to our hypothetical scenario: heat, noise, time pressure, exhaustion. Exhaustion, for example, has been found to significantly degrade general cognitive performance, situational awareness, and reaction time. A second cognitive limitation, and this one you've probably all heard of, is confirmation bias, the tendency of humans to give greater weight to evidence that confirms their pre-existing beliefs than to evidence that calls those pre-existing beliefs into question. To take one of only many examples, studies indicate that confirmation bias is a leading cause of vehicle misidentification in combat. Soldiers expect the vehicles that they come across in combat to be the enemy. So when they come across a vehicle in combat, they tend to focus only on those aspects of the vehicle that indicate that it's an enemy, and they ignore all of the aspects of the vehicle that indicate that they are civilian. What's the result? A very high likelihood of mistaking a civilian vehicle for a military one. A third, and fascinating but particularly troubling cognitive limitation, is what's called object use bias. Researchers have found, and listen carefully to this because I really think that this is incredibly interesting. Researchers have found that a police officer who is holding a gun is more likely to identify an object carried by a suspect as a gun than by a police officer who is holding nothing. In other words, the fact that the police officer has a gun makes him more disposed to recognize things that he sees that a suspect is carrying as a gun than if he was completely unarmed. Now, the relevance of this research to combat, and even to our Human Rights Watch hypothetical scenario, is obvious. Because human soldiers carry weapons, object use bias indicates that they will be more likely to perceive objects held by individuals they encounter as weapons than to recognize them as something like a stick or other harmless item. Those are the cognitive biases. Negative emotions also profoundly distort perception, judgment, and action. Studies have found, for example, that the stress of combat not only leads to perceptual tunneling, reduced working memory, and performance rigidity, it also makes soldiers prone to what is called, quote, ballistic decision-making, making decisions without considering the consequences of their actions. Other researchers have identified what they call, quote, acute combat stress-induced cognitive decline, cognitive impairment that exceeds the cognitive impairment caused by intoxication or even the use of sedatives. That's stress. Anger, an extremely common battlefield emotion, has similar cognitive effects. Researchers have shown, for example, that angry soldiers are less attuned to their external environment, are more likely to ignore new information, are more committed to existing preferences, are more risk-seeking, and often more reactive than non-angry soldiers. Now, these considerations are literally just the tip of the iceberg. I mentioned to you 3 cognitive biases, and there are at least 90 more. The point is that, again, when we compare autonomous weapons to human soldiers in terms of their ability to comply with IHL, we need to take into account the cognitive limits that all humans face and that particularly soldiers face. That changes the calculus significantly, for the simple reason that autonomous weapons are not subject to either cognitive biases nor negative emotions. Machines do not suffer cognitive overload because of multitasking or heat or noise. Machines do not experience confirmation bias or object use bias, and machines do not get tired, do not get stressed, and do not become angry. Now, that said, machines also don't feel positive emotions like mercy and compassion and empathy. And that absence underlies another very common consequentialist critique of autonomous weapons, namely that soldiers must be human because positive emotions are necessary to ensure that combat remains as human as possible. Now, sometimes, with Mr. Asaro, this argument is legal in nature. That's clearly wrong. IHL requires soldiers to follow the rules governing the conduct of hostilities and nothing more. They may well choose not to kill when they are entitled to do so, but that's an ethical decision, not a legal one. So more often, this argument is explicitly normative. that even if soldiers do in fact have the right to kill, it is important to protect the emotions that may lead them not to. Now, I think there are a number of problems with this argument. To begin with, as a critique of autonomous weapons, it's under-inclusive. The quotes from Asaro and from Haynes imagine face-to-face combat, where a soldier can look into the eyes of the enemy, soldier he is about to kill. But again, most warfare is remote. Empathy, mercy, compassion are irrelevant to the bombardier dropping bombs from 35,000 feet, or to the soldier firing a HIMARS rocket at a target that is 50 miles away. And frankly, they're scarcely more relevant to the drone pilot manipulating a joystick thousands of miles away from the battlefield. Now, it's also important not to be seduced by rosy images of compassionate soldiers choosing not to kill the enemy, despite, again, being legally entitled to do so. Consider a situation at Anzio in World War II. The situation is cited by Michael Walzer in his classic Just and Unjust Wars in defense of not killing what he calls the naked soldier. So just take a second to read this scenario. Who would shoot? Raise your hand if you'd shoot. You all make terrible soldiers. That's a compliment. You almost want to raise your hand. Who wouldn't shoot? Most people who venture to raise a hand would not shoot. Well, here is what the British soldier, speaking in the first person, wrote next. Only Sergeant Chestrin didn't laugh. He said that we should have killed the fellow, since his friends would now be told precisely where our trenches were. Now, I'm with Sergeant Chestrin on this one. There is a reason why IHL permits targeting combatants anytime, anywhere, with any amount of force. Why? Because they have both the right and the ability to shoot back. A soldier might feel kinship with an enemy soldier walking in a field, but that enemy soldier has been trained to kill. And if he's left alive now, that is precisely what he will do later. So the, quote, mercy shown toward the enemy soldier might come at an incalculable cost. Finally, invocations of mercy and compassion and empathy also ignore what cognitive psychology tells us about the emotions. Simply put, because of the intense stress of combat, negative emotions are far more common on the battlefield than positive ones. That balance has to be factored into the equation as to whether autonomous weapons or human soldiers are better. Is it really worth keeping alive the occasional act of mercy if the price is the commission of atrocities far greater in number? So, these considerations about judgment and emotion indicate that from a strictly consequentialist perspective, we should probably prefer autonomous weapons to human soldiers. The Enlightenment subject is indeed critical to humane warfare. The problem for the critics is that machines approximate the Enlightenment subject more closely than humans do themselves. And it should not be a surprise that autonomous weapons make better combatants than humans. Humans do not naturally kill, even when their cause is just and their life depends on it. In World War II, for example, research found that only 2 out of every 10 American infantrymen ever fired their weapons at the enemy, even when under attack. 80%, even when being charged at by the enemy, would not shoot at another human being. Armies have known this for a very, very long time, which is why they have devoted so much effort to training soldiers to kill. There's even a name for this science, killology. Now, I don't have time to detail exactly what killology involves. Endless drills, endless target practice at realistic targets, but it works. By the Korean War, 6 out of every 10 American infantrymen would shoot at the enemy, and by Vietnam, that ratio had increased to 9 out of 10. So if you can do the math, that is a very significant increase. Now, well-trained soldiers are often described as, quote, killing machines, but the metaphor is actually both inapt and unfair. It is inapt because no amount of training can ever completely rid humans of their cognitive biases and their negative emotions. Indeed, studies have shown that training soldiers to suppress their emotions, such as anger, such as hate, often has precisely the opposite effect, makes them even stronger. And the metaphor is unfair because machines follow rules in a way that not even the best trained humans actually do. So in short, if we want to produce ideal soldiers, soldiers whose use of force maximally complies with the laws of war, we should encourage the development of autonomous weapons, not seek to ban them. Combat fought by machines will eventually be far more humane than combat fought by actual humans. Now, I think the evidence for this is pretty compelling. So why are so many consequentialists still opposed to autonomous weapons? My suspicion is that, in fact, most are not afraid that killer robots will be worse soldiers than humans. Their real concern is that killer robots will be better soldiers than humans. Now, this is most obvious with consequentialists who emphasize the importance of emotions like mercy and compassion. As we've discussed, they believe autonomous weapons are problematic because only human soldiers can choose not to kill when they're entitled to do so. A killer robot will use force whenever its programming demands it. So although an autonomous weapon that is 100% compliant with IHL is obviously better than one that is 50% compliant with IHL, not even the perfect autonomous weapon is as good as a compassionate human soldier in terms of minimizing violence. But the fear that autonomous weapons will be better soldiers than humans, not worse, is even more evident in critics who emphasize the jus ad bellum, the rules about going to war, not about how you actually fight war. As Noel Sharkey has noted, the threat of dead soldiers is an important deterrent for states contemplating going to war, particularly democratic ones where public opinion directly translates into political power. A state that can replace large numbers of human soldiers with autonomous weapons will find it easier to maintain public support for war than a state that can fight with only human soldiers. Now, this argument contains a grain of truth, and I'm going to come back to it, but it's not entirely adequate in and of itself. Most importantly, the argument assumes that international law should try to deter war by requiring states to risk the lives of as many soldiers as possible. Now, that idea may seem attractive in the context of wars of aggression, and this is a Russian convoy entering Ukraine. Here, we feel little sympathy for the aggressor. But if deterrence fails, it will not be the aggressor's political and military leaders who will suffer from banning autonomous weapons. It will be the human soldiers that they wrongly send into battle. Moreover, and perhaps more importantly, a ban on autonomous weapons would affect any state that had to use military force, even one that was acting in self-defense. Should a state defending itself against aggression, like Ukraine, be required to needlessly risk the lives of its soldiers if it could replace them with autonomous weapons? And as I said, Ukraine is using autonomous weapons. We're not sure whether it's in a fully autonomous mode right now on the battlefield in Ukraine. The ad bellum argument is also under-inclusive. There's little question that the threat of soldiers dying in large numbers can affect a state's willingness to go to war. But that logic applies to any kind of weapon whose use limits soldiers' exposure to harm, from remote-controlled drones to high-altitude bombing. If killer robots should be banned because they minimize the attacker's casualties, any weapon that permits a state to avoid close-up combat should be banned as well. And then finally, and I think most importantly, the ad bellum argument doesn't go far enough. Although publics in democratic states will always care more about the lives of their own soldiers, it is also undeniable, I think, that public opinion is sensitive to civilian casualties on the other side, a lesson that the United States learned the hard way in Vietnam. Simply put, there are only so many My Lais that a democratic populace will be willing to tolerate. So the strongest version of the ad bellum argument against autonomous weapons would not focus solely on how reducing military casualties will make it easier for AWS-capable states to go to war. It would also emphasize how autonomous weapons will have the same effect by producing fewer civilian casualties than wars fought by human soldiers. But here's the problem, and we've encountered it repeatedly. This argument against autonomous weapons applies equally to every other weapon that makes targeting more precise and protect human soldiers from harm. Remote-controlled drones, high-altitude bombers, even sniper rifles. So if AWS critics want to limit war by making it more costly to wage, they not only have to prevent further development of autonomous weapons, they must also convince states to renounce most of the weapons they've spent most of the past century developing. That is a Sisyphean task, to put it mildly. So, to conclude, I think it's ironic that we often speak of the inhumanity of war. War is a uniquely human endeavor, and it is precisely the nature of humans that makes war so violent and so destructive. Instead of arguing that war needs to be made less inhuman, then, perhaps we should argue that war needs to be made more robotic. As I have tried to show in this lecture, the development of autonomous weapons promises far more humane war than war fought solely by human soldiers. Now, to be clear, this does not mean that autonomous weapons are an unmitigated good. That's not what I'm arguing. On the contrary, there is a powerful jus ad bellum argument against killer robots because their development and their use is likely to make the human decision to go to war even easier than it already is. Now, Sir Peter Schaeffer, the great English playwright, once described tragedy as, quote, not a conflict between right and wrong, but between two different kinds of right. That quote, I believe, encapsulates the dilemma created by autonomous weapons. Ending war is obviously a greater good than humanizing it. Nevertheless, given that war remains as endemic today as it was when the first organized peace movements took shape in the early 19th century, we have an ethical obligation to ensure that war leads to as few unnecessary deaths as possible, even if fulfilling that obligation entrenches war still further. And that means, to conclude, that we should encourage states to develop autonomous weapons, not seek to ban them until we have a peace movement that is truly deserving of its name. Thank you. Questions? And I like my little cute robot with the peace symbol.
Great. Thank you very much, Kevin. Why don't you grab a seat, make yourself comfortable whilst... so I'll be collecting questions. I kind of have an urge to ask, make a couple of quick comments and
you have to ask questions because he asks really hard ones.
Exactly. Otherwise, we will have a whole dinner otherwise afterwards. But look, I mean, I just want to say that if there's a part of me, and maybe people in the room will share this, that doesn't really like where this is going, but has trouble finding fault with your argument, and I think that in itself is maybe interesting. And one of the problems this reveals is also weirdly how uncomfortable we are with a world in which IHL is fully complied with, right? Both in its limiting dimension, but also in its permissive dimension, right? That a killer robot would never miss a chance to kill, and maybe one of the saving graces of humans is they're still not as good, despite the training, etc., at it as machines would be. I have just a couple of very quick points. One is, I think that the presentation and the piece hopefully will give rise to focuses heavily on cognitive biases and problems of situational awareness and sort of just limitations of humans. And my sense, if we're looking at a lot of armed conflicts today, that's obviously the fog of war is a perennial problem. But the real problem right now in Ukraine is not, lack of situational awareness by Russians, but and it's not just negative emotions. It's frankly, a policy dedicated to committing crimes against humanity. And that, strikes me, extreme nationalism, hate, racism, etc., are things that, where it strikes me that you go beyond just cognitive biases and where you could probably program the machine to not have them, although I'm also mindful that, algorithms now are frequently being suspected of embedding, stereotypes and racist tropes as well. So that's the first point. The second point is, I think you maybe slightly make the argument a little easier for yourself by focusing on the principle of distinction, where I agree that, right. But so if it's down to, figuring out whether someone is a combatant or not, I think, in a split second, the machine can be programmed to doing a good job of this. Now, as you also know, the reality of armed conflict is increasingly when harm occurs to civilians, it's a result of collateral harm. And collateral harm, I'm obviously not a computer programmer, but strikes me as something just harder to program for, in that it requires not just situational awareness, but also a kind of holistic understanding of what the military advantage sought is, and the kind of collateral harm that might obtain. And so that would constantly have to be updated, I think. I think with recognition of a combatant, you can imagine the algorithm dealing with that. But for collateral harm, you'd need a lot of real-time data that is highly qualitative and ad hoc, that I think, it might be a little trickier. And then my final quick point, and you don't have to answer those, is if we take your argument to its full logic, right? So the argument right now is an argument for allowing the use and development of autonomous killing weapons systems. But what about going further then and including a kind of kill switch in conventional weapons, right? These things exist, right? So just to control humans. So in some car systems, I understand now, will know once the driver gets in if their level of alcohol is too high, and stop them from starting the car. So why don't we program every conventional weapon with at least the ability to correct for wrong decisions by humans. And I'll leave it there, and I think maybe we can pick a few questions. I'm looking at the room. Just please, you can, and I'll start taking hands. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'll typically. Sorry. Oh, sorry. Yeah. All typically smart Fred questions. So the first thing with the kind of the deliberate use of them to kill wrongly, that is a problem, right? They're weapons. We can use all weapons for bad purposes. If you want to use a weapon to target a civilian, you can. And some weapons that are completely conventional, that nobody argues about their illegality, are particularly good at killing civilians if that's how you want to use them. I still think there is something to be said for precision. I'm thinking you mentioned Russia and Ukraine. There's a reason why military analysts are so concerned about Russia running out of precision munitions, because if you don't care whether you're killing civilians, we would rather you use precision weapons than imprecise weapons. We would rather have Assad using, a weapon deliberately to kill a civilian that only kills that civilian, as opposed to dropping chemical weapons that are uncontainable and will kill tens of thousands. So I still think there is something that we want precision weapons, but it is undeniable that weapons can be used for bad purposes. And of course, there is a sense in which I'm assuming in my talk about a military that does care to comply with the laws of war, that is trying to minimize civilian casualties. And I'll often say, we want to know the only thing that's worse than a professional military, it's an unprofessional military. So, it's a perennial problem. But again, I don't think it's an objection to autonomous weapons, because I think there are aspects of autonomous weapons that could minimize the ability to do that. So there's a lot of, I didn't have time to do it tonight, but there's a lot of scholars who say, oh, well, a robot could never disobey a superior order. A human can. There's a famous roboticist, Ron Arkin, who's kind of the leading advocate of the possible humanity of autonomous weapons. He says, well, actually, if you programmed an autonomous weapon with the laws of war, it could refuse to take any programming that contravened it. You can't program a human like that. Humans ignore orders, or don't ignore illegal orders all the time, and conversely, they ignore orders to act legally. So again, I have a friend who's worked for years on drones, and she keeps asking me, she's like, Kevin, when did you become so pro-machine? And I said to her, well, I'm not pro-machine so much as I'm anti-human. And I meant that somewhat tongue-in-cheek. But I'm not saying that autonomous weapons are this magical technology that are going to save us from ourselves, because we're still us. We're still humans. a greater awareness of the limits on humans that I think has to be factored into this discussion, that is really absent. And the whole project, and I'm digressing a little bit, but the whole project was really motivated by the recognition, or my recognition, that all of the same people who said, you cannot let a machine decide to kill because you're taking away human judgment, are the same people who, the minute you're not talking about machines, hate human soldiers, and quite understandably realize that human soldiers are often, Tahrir Square, and the litany of war crimes committed by humans deliberately is endless. So it's not to uncritically valorize machines either. It's about having a deeper conversation about humans versus machines. Now, sorry, I have a couple more. Yeah. With proportionality, it's a really good point, and the principle of proportionality is more difficult to program. There are people who know more about robotics than I have argued that it's possible eventually. But I would just say two things. The first is that proportionality becomes most difficult with imprecise weapons. If you're assassinating a leader of a high-ranking general in a school, and all you can do is drop an imprecise munition on them, that's a very difficult proportionality calculus. You kill all the school kids in order to get the general. If you have the much-feared little wasp autonomous weapon that everyone is so afraid of, and rightfully so, because one can imagine all kinds of dystopian science fiction scenarios, that wasp is just going to kill that general. There will be no proportionality issue because it is so precise with its targeting. So again, I'm not trying to uncritically valorize the technology, but you have to understand that there's also a relationship between the type of weapon being used and the complexity of the IHL problem. And then, of course, last thing, humans are also really bad at proportionality. We're both international criminal lawyers. There's a reason why, in the entire history of international criminal law, there has been one person charged and convicted of launching a disproportionate attack. And that's because it's General Galic, who sat up on the hills outside of Sarajevo and just shelled the city for weeks at a time. Only person has ever been convicted of ignoring proportionality. So, again, not saying that machines are the answer, but humans don't seem to be the answer either with proportionality. So, yeah.
Great. Wonderful. I will ask those of you who have questions to go to the microphone if you want to start. So you can queue there. There's two microphones on one on each side.
Oh, yes. Well, thank you very much for coming once again. It's a rather brave and counterintuitive argument, and also, I believe, exactly contrary to that of your co-author Samuel Moyn in his book Humane. My question has to do with the notion of accountability. So, for instance, the Human Rights Watch example, the soldier guns down the two children. Under international criminal law, there's some mechanism for accountability there. Also, after war is over, maybe there's the idea of truth and reconciliation after armed conflict. I was wondering how you thought the proliferation of AWSs would affect that process.
Well, yeah, and others, please feel free to go in line behind. Yeah, you want to have a question? Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to ask a question. Yeah. I was watching his reaction.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I was going to say, you talked about direct participation a lot in the context of distinction. I was wondering that given that there's this increasingly large class of people that militaries are thinking of targeting now, nuclear scientists, support staff for non-state armed groups, I was wondering if you see it as a particular problem for autonomous weapons to start targeting people who, like the civilian leadership of terrorist organizations, and then to take that to its furthest point, like, do you think that autonomous weapons are going to be used in targeted killing operations, like in Yemen, just let loose, over those kinds of countries? Thanks.
Thank you. I was thinking about liability. We have a lot of issues to get transparency in algorithms, even in the private sector. And I can't imagine how that would be when it goes to national security. Don't you think that the use of AWS could be used as some kind of veil in terms of liability? Like maybe states would start to blame the algorithm to start denying some forms of liability. And that would also involve that we can first identify the person that programmed the machine in the first place. So yeah, I'm just wondering if the use of, I'm not saying that this could not happen with like traditional weapons and humans, but maybe that would make the liability part more difficult to establish. Thank you.
All good questions, and I think the first and the third kind of dovetail, so I can deal with them together. So let me start with yours. Will weapons like this be used to target people who are not lawfully targetable? Absolutely. But that's all weapons can be used to target people who are not targetable. And I suppose my response is kind of similar to my response to Fred, which is, if Israel is going to unlawfully kill Iranian nuclear scientists, I would rather them kill the nuclear scientists with a very precise autonomous weapon than just carpet bomb a nuclear facility or drop, that may be a little overstated, but drop a bomb on that same nuclear scientist and kill 17 other people as well. Again, even when you misuse weapons, misusing precise weapons is not as bad as misusing imprecise ones. And these are they're tools, and I think that's part of the frustrating aspect of the debate over autonomous weapons is the Skynet metaphor. It's always fought at the level of an autonomous weapon that doesn't exist, probably won't exist for the next 50 or 75 years, the general artificial intelligence, where self-learning, that it can actually set its own goals, that may be possible down the road, and I'm the first one, I'm a pragmatist, maybe 50 years from now, we will have types of autonomous weapons where all the issues that are brought up really are salient. But right now, to impute agency to an autonomous weapon is just to, again, as I said before, it's a misuse of language. They don't decide. They may not be completely predictable in terms of every single target that they choose, but that's not any different than a whole range of weapons. So I think, and this will lead into the answer to the other questions, we always have to remember that even though they are in many ways different than the kind of weapons that have been used for centuries, they are still a type of weapon that humans decide how to use. And if they can make combat more humane, if they can target more precisely, I think that's still a good, even if we acknowledge that humans can misuse them in all kinds of terrible ways. Now, the liability and the accountability questions are, I think, really important. And again, I didn't have time to deal with it now, but a very common objection to autonomous weapons is the responsibility gap. I think that most of those arguments are imagining a kind of autonomous weapon that is really long on the horizon, if ever. Not to say that there aren't really difficult issues in terms of identifying responsibility, but in principle, a commander is still responsible for how an autonomous weapon is used. Again, we have to analogize, we have to change the approach, but it is still fundamentally about, did you use that weapon in a way that you knew or should have known was going to lead to the commission of violations of IHL or of war crimes? It also adds a level of complexity in that, that one thing I am very worried about is, and I will tip my hat to my partner in the back of the room, we're really worried about capitalism and the fact that the private sector is much more involved in developing autonomous weapons than most other types of weapons. And I don't really want Elon Musk programming the laws of war into an autonomous weapon. So there are issues there where responsibility is dispersed. So I'm not trying to minimize those problems. What I'm saying is there's nothing qualitatively different about them. There's nothing that should allow us to say, oh, you can't find responsibility with an autonomous weapon, so you can't use them. I don't think that that is a legitimate objection, even acknowledging how difficult the issues are. And the kind of a similar answer to yours, that it is a real concern. I don't trust governments. I'm not a big fan of certainly my own. And of course, they will do everything they can to disperse responsibility and to try to slough off their responsibility on the computer programmers who work for Google or whomever. They're certainly not going to want to open up the black boxes in the autonomous weapons and show you exactly how things took place. But at the same time, you can create an autonomous weapon that does actually keep track of its decision making and have an objective indication of how that decision was made in a way that you can't with a human. With a human, we have to rely on their honesty, their ability to recollect actions correctly, so on and so forth, all things that become very difficult in war. So there's some upsides as well. And to go back to your point, Ron Arkin, again, he often points out, well, actually, if you had human autonomous weapon teams, the autonomous weapon doesn't have any, esprit de corps with his fellow soldiers. If a soldier violates IHL, you have an objective, incontrovertible, uncorruptible resource to make that known to higher ups. So there are some advantages as well to the fact that machines are not human in that respect. So yeah.
I am a Vietnamese, so I grew up after the Vietnam War. So based on your arguments, that the idea is that we don't trust humans because by nature, unlike the Enlightenment human person, in nature we are irrational. So the idea is of giving the authorities and the command of these individuals who have the power to kind of trigger these autonomous weapons. Imagine the My Lai massacre. If Captain Kelly has the power to control a drone nowadays, and he would just send it somewhere among to kind of release his hatred or his kind of prejudices against a minority group of people, what should we do in that situation? Wouldn't that make autonomous weapons like the most dangerous weapons to commit this kind of atrocities in modern time? So I'm just concerned about that because I know what it is like to be destroyed by a group of people with the enormous power of destruction that you had to face. So I really appreciate the answer. Thank you.
We'll take a couple more. Yeah. Sorry, can you talk a tiny bit closer to it? I can't.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
oh, yeah.
Much better.
Okay.
Thanks.
So thank you very much for sharing your fascinating reflection on that. You said a word about my question, but I'm still wondering about asymmetry. Like if you have a state using autonomous weapons, and especially an aggressor state or a state who's waging a war of aggression, wouldn't it, like how would such a state lose the war? Like, like if Russia would use a lot of autonomous weapons and Ukraine wouldn't. Their civilians are more vulnerable. The war is not in Russia, so obviously they are more protected. If their soldiers are not killed because, the weapons are autonomous, what impact does it have on asymmetry and on, yeah.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much. It was very interesting. The thing is that when I think about human in the context of AI application in general, I don't tend to think, I didn't think about it the way that you brought it about, so it's very useful to get a different aspect of what is a critique of the human and the participation in this context of warfare. Because one of the issues that I would have, for example, is that the human contribution to how AWS or AI application can actually be very destructive is its own bias. And through for example, the training of AI through data set, machine learning, and so on and so forth, with the automation of biases and then destructive forces. Just for example, when we're saying, let's integrate IHL within the understanding of the autonomous weapon itself, so that the AI can decide, well, this is not legal according to IHL, so I will not perform this action. However, different states have shown to have different interpretation of IHL, for example, for what concerns the understanding of what a combatant is. This is, for example, the case of the Obama administration when the issue was, yeah, there is no civilian casualties because our drones didn't kill any civilians. They were all combatants. And then you look into it, and the understanding of combatant was any military-age male that was in the context of a strike zone. So in that moment, who is really the civilian and who is the combatant? And the autonomous weapon, if it's thought this, would just reproduce it. So the issue, even here, is not the weapon itself, it's the human. Because the understanding is the same, whether if it's someone behind a controller, a joystick, or whatever, or just an AI, is still the same. So I guess what would be very useful from a normative perspective at the international level would be to implement regulation that are broadly and globally understood in order to then apply them to the training of AI rather than leaving this to each state and on its own. Because even when it was mentioned about asymmetry, who decides? Even there's asymmetry. So yeah, thank you very much. Sorry, maybe it wasn't a great question, it was more of a comment. Thank you.
Thank you. One last question. Well, one last question. We'll group them. You can be fine.
Hi, Kevin. Thanks for coming back. I didn't want to let you get away without drawing your attention to a bit of a paradox in your argument, in the sense that, so you've shown that humans are flawed. And, this probably will not shock anyone. But showing that doesn't necessarily need that machines are preferable. Because surely the idea of a perfect machine is as unreal as the idea of the perfect human. And my impression is that the consensus is that machines are very good or much better than humans at making particular kinds of determinations and are not so good at other kinds of exercises that are needed in human living. So machines are very good at playing chess or Go, not so good at writing symphonies. And it then turns to, okay, how do we determine what are the parameters of the behavior that is desirable in war? And the invocation of IHL really is not much of an answer. I say that as an IHL scholar, right? And there's a lot that is undetermined in the legal standards that we have. So many of the decisions that are required to be made in order to make a determination on the battlefield are in fact closer to writing a symphony than to playing chess. And in that sense, I think the outcome of your argument isn't to make war less humans, but to imagine a coexistence, a symbiotic relationship between human decision-making and machine decision-making, right? And it always reminds me, when I teach IHL, I often mention the case of the USS Vincennes in the Persian Gulf, where the computers on board determined that an Iranian airliner was flying on a straight line, not threatening approaching the ship. But the commander and officers disregarded this information and fired a missile that brought down an airliner that was a civilian airliner. It was with 135 passengers. And so this is the way that we have to negotiate. You get an outcome that is less neat than the one you suggest, but I think is more interesting. Otherwise, ultimately, your reasoning leads to suggest that we should replace judges by computers, because that's how law works. And I'm not sure that's actually where you want us to go. And this way of thinking has to be brought to the battlefield as well, because law operates there in the very same way that it operates in the courtroom and in every other setting.
Okay, lots to talk about. But actually, I briefly want to come back to you. I don't know if you've seen Annie Hall, with the famous scene where the ponderous NYU professor is going on about Marshall McLuhan, and then Woody Allen says, well, I happen to have Marshall McLuhan right here, and he pulls Marshall McLuhan from behind a poster and says, actually, you're an idiot, and I agree with him. So I wanted to have my Sam Moyn moment with doing exactly the same thing, because Sam and I have talked a lot about this, and I actually think my argument is extremely Moyn-esque in the sense that I think he's widely misunderstood, but I guess I'm trying to articulate what he hasn't articulated so clearly, which is we are faced with this really, really awful Hobson's choice where nobody wants excessive people to die. Everybody wants war to be more humane, but war that is more humane is more likely to be fought. And in the long run, we may have more casualties that way. And I think that's the essence of his argument. And that's what I'm trying to show with autonomous weapons, that we're faced with a very similar tension there. And I want to get rid of war. I don't want humane war. I want no war. But I also don't think I'm going to live to see the end of human conflict. And in the absence of that, I have a very hard time saying we shouldn't do what we can to minimize casualties, even knowing what the unintended consequences are. Okay, gosh, where to begin? With your comment. I mean, My Lai it's a really striking laboratory for this kind of idea. Because on the one hand, imagine how bad My Lai would have been without the incredibly brave chopper pilot who literally, I think he died like only 3 or 4 months ago, who landed between Cali and the remaining civilians that hadn't been killed yet. He and his team pointed their machine guns at Cali and his fellow soldiers and said, if you don't stop firing, we will kill you all. And that was the only thing that ended the My Lai massacre. And in a world that didn't have any human soldiers, that person would not have been there to stop the massacre. And of course, that's incredibly striking and powerful. And every time I read that story, that's the story that makes me cry. It's not the civilian casualties so much, because we're all inured to that. It's those incredible acts of heroism that we all would like to think we would do, but none of us really probably would. But by the same token, think about the collective psychosis that overtook all of the human soldiers that were responsible for the My Lai massacre. I mean, they were all reasonably well-trained professional soldiers who systematically murdered women and children because none of their higher-ups had any real significant control or even any desire to control them. So you wouldn't have the acts of mercy and compassion and heroism, but you also might have a lot less of the actions that require it in the first place. And I don't know how to resolve that tension. My gut tells me that the acts of mercy and compassion and heroism are less in number than the acts of murder and torture and hatred. And I think on balance, I would still make that trade. But it is precisely that kind of situation that really illustrates how difficult this tension really is. So I appreciate the comment. With the asymmetry, to get back to, I don't know where, there you are. It's also a really difficult issue. Unfortunately, not every country is capable of developing autonomous weapons. The ones who are most assiduously pursuing them are not my favorite. I don't trust the US or Russia or China. But they're coming. I mean, that's the real problem. I'm sympathetic. I have many friends who are deeply involved in the campaign to stop killer robots. They're not going to stop killer robots. There's not going to be an international treaty prohibiting them. The US, China, Russia, India, Brazil, Israel, the UK, France, Germany, none of them are ever going to give up the quest for replacing their soldiers with machines. And so we have to think about ways to ensure that they're used responsibly. And there will always be irresponsible uses. Again, that's the nature of weapons. But we have to grapple with the issues. Like I teach in Denmark, and a lot of the work that I do is actually kind of writing a report and advising the Danish Parliament and the MOD and the MFA on these issues. And even a state like that has to grapple with these issues because they partner with countries that will be eventually using autonomous weapons. When NATO has a military mission, they're going to have to figure what is Denmark's position going to be if the US is using an autonomous weapon. Are they in favor of them? Are they against them? Are they not going to, the same kinds of things that drones have raised to some extent, like in Germany. So it is an unfortunate paradox that technology that I really do think could render combat more humane is being developed by countries that we probably don't want fighting in the first place, because they're often not particularly concerned with the laws of war. But again, that's not an asymmetry that is unique to autonomous weapons. It's any advanced weapon in the hands of a country that doesn't want to use them well is going to be more dangerous. And I still think there are some advantages to the inherent nature of autonomous weapons that does make them perhaps have slightly more potential for being used in a humane way than even like a manned drone, precisely because of the ability to take the human out of it to some extent, and I'll come back to that. The third question was also a really good point, that, you know, in some sense, my whole argument is facile in that we're not taking humans out of the equation with autonomous weapons. We're moving where in the kill chain the humans come. I mean, autonomous weapons, at least now and for the next 50 or 75 years, are not going to program themselves. They are programmed by humans. They are liable to all of the same kinds of biases and problems that, you know, that afflict any human decision. That said, trying to have humans make responsible decisions in the heat of combat is a lot harder than trying to get decisions to make responsible decisions before the battle ever takes place in the relative safety of a programming room or a boardroom. They're more likely to have better human decision making ex ante than in media res, much less ex post. But we do always have to remember that the weapons will only be as good as the humans that program them. And we have seen that AI tends to reproduce all of the sexism and the racism and you know, every other ism that we can possibly imagine when they're programmed by humans. But they can be programmed better. More recently, you know, you all probably know about I don't know if it was OpenAI or another company, but basically their artificial intelligence sucking everything up and then became really racist and sexist. And they realized that, well, all the inputs, you know, you don't want them to read QAnon. You don't want them to read, you know, all of this other kind of patriarchal racial literature. But they were able to fix it to some extent. They're getting better because they are trainable and not, in a sense, corruptible in the same way that a human is. One thing I don't touch on in this lecture, and I will in the much longer article that I'm working on, humans don't get better at decision making. This is one of the sad truths. There is cognitive behavioral training. There are ways to de-bias human decision making. Almost none of them are successful in the context of combat. The only way you de-bias people of their cognitive biases is to get them to think more carefully and slowly and deliberately and taking in more information and making a more reasoned decision. And there's a really interesting US Army paper on, can we make our soldiers better at making decisions, where they finally said, and I'm paraphrasing, but I'm essentially saying what they said, the only way to make human soldiers better soldiers is to not make them soldiers anymore, because the nature of combat is such that you just can't improve human decision making. So again, I am really not trying to be this like heralding the next great robotics age, but there is still something about the technology that should give us a little bit of hope that we can make it better over time in a way that I just don't have the same hope for making humans better over time. We're, I think, inherently flawed. And then just very quickly on the last question with the paradox. Yeah, I think actually I might need like 6 hours to respond to that question. But I don't think anyone is trying to say that we should just get rid of all human soldiers and put autonomous weapons on the battlefield. It's never going to happen. It's really about figuring out what types of combat are autonomous weapons, both now and in the not too distant future, going to be better at than humans. And there's a whole other part of this, putting in a big grant application, where I really we're bringing together roboticists and cognitive psychologists and IHL scholars to really do a very fine-grained empirical study of what types of specific combat situations can we imagine short-term, medium-term, long-term autonomous weapons being better at. And they will never be able to do certain things. There will always be certain types of combat, probably dense urban fighting, where IHL is so difficult to comply with and so uncertain that robots will never be able to do it well enough. But again, maybe I'll leave with this because you look like you want me to stop. Not at all. We also have to acknowledge the reality that, I'm sure if you read in this space, it's always meaningful human control. We have to have autonomous weapons with meaningful human control. Sounds great, even putting aside the fact that humans are really bad at controlling machines and subject to a whole bunch of other biases that I could have talked about but didn't in this lecture. Combat is getting too fast. And there will be a point where meaningful human control is simply impossible. And to try to say to states, risk more of your soldiers to slow down combat enough to make sure that a human can stay in or on the loop is just not, it's a non-starter. Again, I wish it was a starter. I think that's better in some ways. But it's not the reality that we are facing. And again, it's just, for me, it's a realism. We're not going to stop the development of these weapons. We're not going to keep humans in and of the loop for very much longer. We need to figure out how to control them and use them the best we possibly can. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Kevin. And I'm reminded this is in the sort of best tradition of international humanitarian law, pragmatism. I think since you're only human, you probably made a few mistakes along the way. But I just want to say how glad we are that we had you in person and not a well-programmed robot scholar to come to to speak to us. So please join me to thank Kevin for this great talk. Thank you.